Hi everyone, thank you for joining us today. My name's Sean Cottrell. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Law in Sport. I'm going to be your host for today. We're just waiting for everyone to log in. So if you can just bear with us for a few minutes whilst we're waiting. I hope you're having a great day. We've got a fantastic session for you. We should be finishing, hopefully, bang on the hour at 2 o'clock UK time. One of the things you can do whilst we're waiting, and I was saying to the guys about this in terms of there's got to be a better way to deal with this sort of awkward moment while we're waiting for everyone to log in with Zoom. If you would like to, just introduce yourself in the chat so we know who's there, what work you do in relation to sports charities, where you're from. Some people really like to put their LinkedIn profiles so you can connect and build relationships with people with a shared interest. If you want to do that, I wish there was a prize. I need to come up with one for the person who does it first, because always it normally takes one person to kick it off, but it's just something that's quite useful. We have got an there you go, brilliant. Thank you, Peter. Well done to you. I said, need to come up with, if you've got any ideas for a good prize, let me know in the chat as well. We'll come up with one. So those of you that aren't familiar with Zoom, and I presume most of you all are now, there's a Q&A feature. So we use the chat to introduce each other, to have a discussion there. If you want to ask a question to our panelists, if you use the Q&A feature, that just makes it easier for me as a moderator just to know it's a question, because sometimes if there is a lot of back and forth or useful resources being shared in the chat, sometimes it can be difficult to identify that. So we're going to get going in about 1 minute's time. If you do have questions throughout, please put them in the Q&A area and I will come to them at the appropriate time. And thank you everyone for embracing the introductions. That's brilliant. So welcome Sarah, Julia, Jodie, Joanne, Rachel. I'm going to stop there because if there's loads more, we'll never start the webinar. But look, really appreciate you all being with us today. Thank you. So we'll just wait till 5 past, and then we shall get going. Right, here we are on the hour. Right, so we've got a fantastic, I'm putting pressure on them, a fantastic session for you today. Hopefully the main thing is, you know, from I think this is representative of Joe and Gary as well, that we want it to be really useful for you. And hopefully, you know, some of you, we can see from the chat, have got lots of experience already. And so you know, hopefully there's nuggets though of information that you can take out and put into practice within your organizations or in your respective role on a board or as a trustee. So to introduce yourselves, for those who don't know me, my name's Sean Cottrell. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Law in Sport. I'm going to welcome Joe Hobbins. Joe, do you want to introduce yourself?
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for finding the time. My name's Joe Hobbins. I am a solicitor. I have the pleasure of acting on behalf of charities and not-for-profit organisations. A part of that offering is that we act for lots of sports clubs, everything from the A to Z of sports clubs, so everything from athletics clubs all the way down to Zorb football clubs. Full disclosure, I haven't actually acted for a specific Zorb football club, but if anyone knows of any, then please do put me in contact.
Brilliant. Thanks, Joe. Gary?
Hi everyone, thanks for making the time and jumping on. My name is Gary Stannett. I'm currently the CEO of the Rio Ferdinand Foundation. We're a charity based in England, but we work across the UK and Ireland, and more recently we have moved into supporting like-minded organisations working in communities around the world, specifically Africa at the moment. And my background has been around the charitable sector and the public sector for probably the last 25 years. That's included being a trustee of a football club charity, founding my own charity a few years ago, which went on to work with the British Council around the world. And then I was also a co-founder with Rio of the foundation, but I formally came in as CEO of the foundation around 5 years ago when we decided to upscale the organisation and the reach of our work. So good to meet you all and looking forward to this session.
Brilliant. Thanks, Gary. And also you got an MBE that you failed to mention for your work and services, I believe, to young people and communities. So yeah, great work on that front. But yeah, it's funny to people. If I had MBE, everyone would know about it. It'd be everywhere. Right. So to kick us off, so what we've got as a format is we've got some slides. The slides will be circulated afterwards. They're just meant to be an anchoring for a talking point. So Joe's going to cover off the more like hard law side of things, and Gary's going to provide the more practical perspectives. So let me share screen. So, Joe, to start us off, did you just want to cover off from your side what you're going to cover?
Absolutely, yeah. So this is meant to be, I've drafted the slides in a very informative way. By no means do I intend to read completely off the slides, but I believe the slides will be shared with you as a PDF after the session. So I've included a lot of QR codes, and what I don't want to do is information overload. So I'm imagining we'll be speaking about some of the practical implications of what's on the slides. So with that being said, we'll start off by just a simple overview and a reminder of what it means to be a charity trustee. We'll quickly move on to the core duties and trustees of a charity trustee as defined by the Charities Act. And then before moving into the role of the Charity Commission, just with some wider context, that will really feed into why the core duties and trustees are so important and what the implications of not following those could be. And then finally, I intend to just provide some useful materials and information which can be a useful take home and hopefully might be able to help with the implementation of good governance as a general principle.
Brilliant, thank you. So, Joe, what else do you want to cover off this slide first?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So, yeah, just as a very, very brief reminder, what it means to be a charity trustee, covered by Section 117 of the Charities Act 2011. So, yeah, essentially, it's the person's having the general control and management of the charity. So, it doesn't necessarily mean the title given if you're acting as a trustee but haven't been formally appointed, in the same way as sort of directorship, you could be found to be sort of de facto trustee. But that being said, the means of appointing a charity trustee are usually very clearly documented within the governing document of a charity. So speaking of charity, what does that mean? Charities essentially in their most common forms are, as on the screen, charitable incorporated organization, CIO, charitable companies, often charities, companies limited by a guarantee with charity status. There can also be unincorporated associations which have their charity status registered, the same as trusts. So what this doesn't mean is community interest companies, are often referred to as CICs, and community amateur sports clubs, which is also referred to as casks. So those are not charities, and can be sort of quite a common misunderstanding that those are charities when in fact they're not. So that's what the trustees' duties apply to.
Brilliant, thank you. And we're going to come on to sort of like the core roles of a trustee, but Gary, before we do that, I was just wondered if I could bring you in at this point to begin with, because the Rio Ferdinand Foundation has gone through a substantial amount of change and growth, right, in terms of the impact of his work. Can you describe and just take us through that journey, and particularly around your trustee board, I believe, has been pivotal and getting that right in terms of this adaptation that you've had to make?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Rio Ferdinand Foundation is almost 15 years old now, and it was set up all those years ago by Rio, really in response to some quite negative conversation around young people, and particularly young people from working class communities, and particularly young people from the Black community at the time. A lot of the conversation was very much couched in terms of knives, gangs. I think feral youth was the term that was being used by the Prime Minister at the time. And Rio, obviously coming from Peckham, and then more broadly, a lot of our team coming from South London and from parts
Best part of the
Greater
country,
Manchester.
I might add.
A wonderful part of the country. There was a recognition, really, that young people everywhere had talents, they had aspirations, they had ambitions, but they didn't always have opportunities, networks to support and grow and to achieve their potential. So the foundation was set up 15 years ago. And initially, it was a very small charity. Really, it was really focused on Salford in Manchester, and it was focused in Peckham in South London, and really without much ambition to move beyond providing opportunities for young people in those areas. At the time, the trustee board, I think, like a lot of player foundation trustee boards, it was made up of people that were working with Rio from the sports industry more broadly. So financial advisors, accountants. The chair was Rio's mum, who was a youth worker in Peckham. She was very, very, very passionate around the work we did. But it was very much sort of people that were working either as football agents or financial advisors or lawyers around the playing and the professional sports side of Rio's career who were on board for the charity. The program itself was great. It ticked along quite nicely, but it was very, very small scale. And I think it would probably be fair to say in hindsight that a lot of those trustees maybe didn't have the experience or the knowledge base around what it was like to work in the charitable third sector, whatever words you want to put on it, which was kind of the role that I took on board for Rio at the time, just providing a bit of advice and guidance. I'm going to fast forward rather than do 15 years of blow-by-blow history. But a few years ago, there was quite a significant change happened. You would probably remember Rio's mother died of cancer after a long battle. It coincided with around the same time that Rio was finishing his football playing career. And we had a conversation in 2018 around how we wanted to move the foundation forward. And I think there was a real emphasis on growing the foundation and trying to turn it into something that would have a much more national reach. And within national, we also started working in Ireland as well alongside that because of Rio's mum's heritage in and around the Dublin area. As a part of that, we needed to review the trustee board and really grow it. So from our perspective, we sat down and we looked closely at what the trustee board would be like. We did an open recruitment process. And I think we might come onto this later, so I won't go too much into it right now. But it wasn't actually as successful as we would have hoped, and I can dig into that a little bit more, Sean, if we're going to go back to that in the future. But one of the things we realised was we really needed to identify what skills base we needed in our trustees board, and we went on a bit of a headhunting mission to identify the right people for the role. And specifically for us, it was around finding somebody with a good solid legal and HR background, someone with a good finance background, someone with a good commercial background, as well as people that were really, really passionate around the work that the foundation was doing. And I think that enabled us to review our processes, put into place a much more firm kind of structure and basis to grow the organization. That in turn gave funders more of a kind of confidence in what we did when they did the due diligence. And as a result, the program has gone from roughly 250,000 turnover working in 2 or 3 small communities 5 years ago to more or less a £2 million charity working across UK and Ireland, and starting to work with partners internationally around how we can contribute to that global sport for development movement. So significant growth, and the trustee board was a very, very key part of that process.
Thank you, Gary, because I think that's really important because, and I'm sure that a lot of people listening will identify with some of those issues, that you've got really well-intended people that feel connected to whatever the cause of the charity is, but maybe it may not have the most optimal or the most skilled people with the respective skills that are required to make the trustee board as effective as possible. So coming on to this then, Joe, because I wondered, there was also Gary, I'll save this question actually for later. Joe, maybe you can then talk about some of the core responsibilities of the trustee board, because no doubt being very well aware of this can also help you transition maybe legacy members of the board, or even just articulate to the board if there's additional members that need to be brought on.
Yeah, definitely. I think what Gary was saying a minute ago about the sort of, I like to refer to it as a skills audit in terms of looking at which trustees and which experience you have on the trustee board, in terms of sort of looking at it. And I think the big buzzwords and the big topics in sport, and they go beyond being buzzwords. Safeguarding, for example, health and safety, social media, fundraising, all of those big topics in terms of just identifying those gaps and seeing, okay, well, which trustee would be good. And I think quite fortunately, long gone are the days where it's sort of like a trustee board is just a group of friends that's just like, yeah, well, my mates have got a bit of time and we'll get together on the weekend. Fortunately, a lot of trustee boards do come to be good friends, but I think that general principle of just having the necessary skills on the board really speaks to all of the duties.
And before we get on to that, how often, just because you mentioned it, in terms of skill audit, how often should you be doing that?
Well, I think that there's no sort of set recommendation set in stone, but I imagine sort of annually, or as and when when trustees leave, when trustees are appointed. I suppose it's rather sort of best to be proactive rather than reactive in terms of looking at what you haven't got before it comes an issue. If you suddenly have a big safeguarding concern that comes up and think, oh, actually, I wish we had someone on the board that was able to do safeguarding. in hindsight, a lot easier said than done. But yeah, with these sort of, as I loosely refer to the term skills audit, I believe there are some materials online whereby you can sort of have a look at the key principles, and there'll be some that are more relevant to other charities. As I say, I use the word safeguarding because that's very, very important and topical in sports at the moment. Whereas for say a grant making charity, they may not see as much of a need to have a designated safeguarding expert on the board.
Brilliant, thank you. So should we get into the duties then?
Absolutely, yeah. So yeah, looking at duty number one, I've got some information on the slides, just to sort of speak to the information which is already there in front of you. The sort of legal requirements, what they may look like. So sort of legal requirements tend to look like, above age 16 and above as an age requirement, not being previously disqualified from being a trustee. There can also be regulations around bankruptcy, criminal records. So those are the legal requirements. When setting up a new charity, the trustees of that organisation will sign what's known as a trustee eligibility declaration, whereby you're essentially ticking the box that you are eligible. It's not required for new oncoming trustees, but it's recommended that that information is passed on. Speaking of that, there can be also provisions within the governing document which need to be checked. So a lot of charities do now require, for example, a DBS check. There can also be increased age requirements. So where there's charities which are dealing with particularly sensitive topics, they can reasonably require trustees to be over the age of 18 for obvious reasons. It probably may not be appropriate for a 16, 17-year-old to be subject to some of the conversations that are happening within the charity. And then, looking at the charity's purpose, acting pursuant to the objects. The objects are really the fundamental principle of what the charity does. And how far-reaching that public benefit is.
Brilliant, thank you.
So that feeds nicely into complying with the governing document and the surrounding law. So governing document, there's the key principles like the objects and the powers. The powers will usually feed off of the objects. So, say, for example, with a sports charity, the powers will often be to, purchase or lease land in order for you to have the sports facilities, employ people, borrow money, loan money. It's usually quite an extensive list, but there's usually quite a catch-all power where it's sort of anything in pursuance of the objects, anything legal, I must add.
And I was going to bring Gary here. Gary, is this something that you had to, when you've looked and said how the origins of the foundation, is this something that you've had to sort of revisit since 2018 as you sort of, at that moment, as when Rio was reflecting on what the charity was doing?
We haven't really, because we were quite broad in the way that the charity was set up. So we haven't had to go back and review. I mean, we have reviewed it to make sure that we are still consistent, and we do that on an annual basis. But we've never actually had to go back and change the aims and objectives, because it was quite broad in providing opportunities for young people. It's a very sort of catch-all way of doing it. But we have gone back, and especially when we started to work on the international stage, and we've taken advice as well to see whether or not we needed to change those objects. But we've never had to actually formally change anything, Sean, over that time period.
Brilliant, thank you. And then
I should add,
sorry, go on, Joe.
I was just going to say, I should add as well that if you're looking to make changes to the objects of a charity, that's what's considered a regulated alteration, and for which you will always need charity commission consent. For the most part, CIOs, charitable companies, there are some nuances where it may not be required, but those tend to be in relation to more historic trusts. So regulated alterations being objects, benefits and payments to trustees, and the dissolution clauses of the charity commission consent will most likely be needed.
Great. And then moving on to so you mentioned keeping abreast of key laws that you need to be compliant with there as well, which I know that's a consistent challenge for any organisation, but particularly a charity, I guess, which is why, as Gary was saying, having a legal expert on your trustee board is probably a good idea.
Most definitely, yeah. And given that charities are so far-reaching in terms of the laws that apply to them, the Charities Act being the big one, but also there are Companies Act provisions which will apply to directors, so trustees of charitable companies will also be subject to directors' duties. But then also charities will likely have land, if not leases, employees, their whole data. You file accounts, so it's very, very wide spanning in terms of what a charity's outreach requires compliance with the relevant jurisdictions and laws.
Brilliant.
So yeah, this is one that sort of crops up, and it should always be at the heart of every decision. There's a lot of overlap here between understanding the best interest of the charities and conflicts of interest. So knowing how to overcome conflicts of interest or address them adequately. So decisions must always be taken with a trustee's hat on. I always like to use the analogy of sometimes you may need to take another hat off in terms of if you're a trustee and also a parent of one of the players of a sports club. You need to take your parent's hat on and put the trustee hat on in terms of what's in best interest of the charity here. So yeah, in terms of making decisions in the best interest of the company, there's a charity, sorry, there's a useful QR code in the corner, which is a link to CC27, which is Charity Commission Guidance 27, which is essentially making best practice and decision making in following those principles.
I may be wrong here, but I do think, because I thought this many years ago, a presentation on this topic, with the conflict of interest and conflict of loyalty point, and or conflict of loyalty point seems to be one where, again, in a sports charity in particular, it can become a bit of a challenge to say, for example, you're associated to a football club, and there's objective of the football club, and there's objective of the actual charity itself. Is that something you see a lot of?
Definitely, and we could very easily fill a whole hour session on conflicts of interest, as you could understand. It's very topical. I think that the good example here is, say for example, you're a charity trustee, but you also own the premises which the charity is on. There's no way you can make decisions in the best interest of the charity, as well as also your best interest as being a landlord, for example. Fortunately, conflicts of interest are usually very well covered in the governing document, whether that be constitution, articles of association, but there are also very useful resources you can make use of by way of a conflict of interest policy, where it really sets out, okay, so maybe I don't understand what a conflict of interest is here. Let's sort of find an example. Let's see if this is a conflict of interest. It's very broad, but it should be implemented and followed quite closely.
And I guess if you're either renewing or getting on new trustees, then the onboarding process gives you a great opportunity to go through that in a lot of detail to make sure that they're compliant. Okay, great. And then you've also put about trustee benefits. Is this something that, I guess, and again, Gary, is this something you've had to deal with in terms of something that's cropped up, or in your role that hasn't been something that hasn't you got clear guidance on, hasn't been an issue?
From our perspective, there aren't really any trustee benefits, so our trustees don't actually try to claim. So other than travel expenses, because obviously we try and make sure that our trustees are representative geographically of the areas we work in. So other than travel expenses, then we don't really have any other benefits on the trustees. So it's not something that's ever cropped up with the Rio Ferdinand Foundation piece. I think on the conflicts of interest loyalty one, I think it's quite an interesting one there. Sometimes if you are on the board of a foundation that's allied to a professional football club, and if you're employed by the club but you sit on the charity board, that's always an interesting one, because things like rental costs for office space within a football stadium often come up. So I think it's quite an interesting one that could be quite unique there for foundations linked to professional clubs as well.
So I guess it's just, so this is really identifying it, and then, as you said, Joe, having the right strategy and guidance in terms of how you resolve that. Should we move on to the next duty?
Of course, yeah. I'd like to think that this one is quite self-explanatory in terms of, this includes everything that the charity does. So in terms of, managing investments properly, I think it's a useful topic there in terms of sports foundations. One topic we're seeing at the moment is where the club's interests, and especially in struggling sports, where the leagues are seeing a downfall in attendance. the club's best interest is to boost profit. Sometimes where there's that office space, that we want to put the rent up. So where there is that crossover of trustees on the board, in terms of acting responsibly, and the big question is, whilst the foundation will always have an intrinsic link and relation to the club, is it absolutely necessary for the objects for you to be located on the sports ground? I.e., there the question is always, could you be getting a better deal elsewhere in order to be able to deliver the objects? Now, it's a very, very heavy decision to take by trustees, because of course you want to be on the same premises. You've got that atmosphere, you've got the players nearby, the staff nearby. So it's a real balancing act, but it kind of feeds into the previous one in terms of acting in the best interest of the charity.
And just as a practical step, so you're on a trustee board. You believe that either there's been an infringement of conflict of interest, or you don't think it's in the best interest of the charity. At that point, what should you do in terms of, obviously, no doubt, document your view, but at what point is it essentially it's not fatal, let's say, to your participation as a trustee? At what point do you have an obligation that you have to, you feel you might be put in a position, I imagine, where you have to resign? Where's the line?
Of course, there's definitely lots of balances in place. I think you'd hope that resigning would be a very much a last resort. But yeah, I think ultimately there will be an inkling. There will always be an area of doubt in terms of thinking, if I'm conflicted, then I need to investigate this. Step one is always to declare the conflict of interest, because sometimes it can be managed in terms of just not being privy to some information, not being privy to the discussions about it. It could be that it's overcome by fact of, I can't think of an example off the bat, but it could be that you are able to be part of those conversations. But the safest thing to do is it would usually just be to take a step back. I feel I'm conflicted. I feel there's a real risk that I'm conflicted. I'll step away from these conversations, but I'll still maintain being a trustee. But I just will make sure that there's that information barrier where I'm not privy to those conversations, but also I'm not able to access that information. That does come with a few issues that you'll need to be comfortable with. There's always the principle of collective responsibility. A decision of the trustee board is sort of seen as a decision of the board collectively. But yeah, there are lots of checks in place, which the governing document and definitely a conflicts of interest policy should cover off. But you'd like to think that resigning would be the last resort.
I was thinking about the latter point that you made in terms of where there's not a unified, with their collective responsibility, there's not a unified approach. I know from speaking to people personally on this, has been a bone of contention and concern where they're worried about the direction in which a charity is going in, and whether or not, where that leaves them personally in terms of, and we've seen this obviously with the fallout with the investigations from the Charity Commission, when they look back at some of the behaviour, but maybe I think some of it will probably come on to later. Should we go on to the next duty?
Of course, yeah. So the duty of care, I think it's important to cover off here. Sort of, it's all very well talking about sort of the trustee responsibilities, but it's sort of, who do these apply to? Who do you owe the duty of care to? So of course, we've spoken about the best interests of the charity, but these duties are owed to other trustees, staff members, volunteers, beneficiaries, essentially anyone within the sort of the charity space. And then it leads on to the public contracting parties, Charity Commission. So the duty of care is very, very wide reaching. But in terms of what that duty is, as you can see there, to use reasonable care and skill in making the decisions. It's interesting because we were speaking earlier about that skills audit point. The next slide is essentially that enhanced duty of care, whereby if you hold yourself to have a special knowledge, so the example earlier we were using of safeguarding, you sort of have that enhanced duty where you're delivering that expertise to the board. So if a matter comes up on safeguarding and you think, oh, I think I'll sit this one out, it's sort of that's what you're offering to the board. So it comes with that sort of, as I say, that enhanced duty whereby you're held almost to a higher standard than your fellow trustees. That being said, it's your duty to inform the board so that then the board can make the best decision.
Brilliant, thank you. Do you want to cover off this one, and I'm going to go back in, I think.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, yeah, accountability. They're very, very wide-reaching. Terms such as the charity SORP for charities in England and Wales, Charity Commission regulation, which we'll get onto, filing accounts, trustees' annual returns and annual statements that they make. Very, very wide-reaching. I suppose this one's really just in terms of making sure that you've got the adequate guidance out there in terms of accounting advice, legal advice. Yeah, as we say, it's wide reaching, but overall, this is where essentially the sort of sanctions come in as well, because it's all too often we see a statutory or inquiry come about from the Charity Commission, and that can sort of the trigger for that can be something as simple as filing the accounts late. I don't want to say filing the accounts late in terms of saying that's quite a trivial thing. It's really not, but something as simple as that can lead to a statutory inquiry being published and ultimately can lead to the charity being closed down. So that accountability is just in terms of making sure that you're staying on the good side of your regulators.
Brilliant, thank you. And so coming back to Gary on this, because I thought you've clearly identified obviously why it's great. We know that I think is very well explained. The different makeup of a trustee board, why it's great to have a skill-based board, which you like to think would be widely agreed. But as you know, in sport, it can be very, not just on the charity side, but across the board. There's varying degrees of acceptance around that in practice. And you've gone through the trustee duties. Gary, you mentioned that I thought was quite interesting that when you were recruiting your trustees, you went through a headhunting process. And I wondered if you could just talk about why, because I would assume it's partly because of the fact that there is this significant responsibility as a trustee. There's a lot for you to take on board, obviously a lot for a trustee to offer, but a lot to take on board. Can you just share some insights into why you took the approach you took?
Sure. We started out with a little bit of a open recruitment process. So we sort of put out there that we were looking for new trustees, and we advertised, and we sort of gave a bit of a breakdown of the role and the skills base. But if I'm honest, Sean, we found, without going too much into detail, I think that we found when we were interviewing some of the potential trustees, there was a sense that perhaps it was the name Rio Ferdinand, the affiliation or the perceived affiliation with Manchester United, the professional football thing, that seemed to be the driving factor rather than necessarily a huge commitment to the work we were trying to do and what we were trying to achieve. So I think there was a little bit of a kind of, let's take a step back and consider this a different way. We do need a new trustee board. We want to grow the organisation. What do we do? So going back to Joe's point, we did a very, very intensive skills audit, and we looked at, okay, look, this is the Rio Ferdinand Foundation. And I'm sure I've seen people that are here with professional football clubs that are above their name. You have a brand that you've got to be aware of as well. So there's always that in the back of our minds. You've got a sort of a brand integrity that you've got to keep as well. So we just went through the process of, okay, well, if we're going to move this forward, we're going to have to kind of be able to give funders the assurances they need that this is a well-run charity, that it's delivering what it says on the tin, everything that goes with it. So we kind of pretty much identified 5 key areas that we were looking at in the first instance. So the first one is we absolutely needed somebody that would understand the sort of the legal context and the legal background to the organisation and how we work. So we brought on board somebody who's a trained lawyer, who used to be on the Court of Arbitration in Sport, works heavily in the higher education sector now, and has a real sort of good grasp on especially the HR and the human resources and the laws around employment and what have you that goes with that. Finances are absolutely key. I think, Joe, you said there in terms of key sort of functions, getting a grasp on the finances of the charity. So we went out and we worked through people that we'd either met through the Olympic Development Agency or through Sport England, and we brought on board an accountant who had a really strong background in large-scale public sector or charitable programs, and we brought them on board. We also went and found somebody who had worked at a senior level in local authority, specifically around sport and youth services, who had a background in safeguarding and child protection, who we brought on board. And then more broadly, we then sort of stepped. So we kind of felt that was, if you like, the safety net that we needed to be able to say we have that expertise around us. And if people want to know who's on the board, we've got that skills base. And then we looked more broadly at what the organisation was trying to achieve. So we went out and we found somebody who had a strong track record in community development, had overseen regeneration projects for local authorities. And then obviously Rio came back on board as a trustee with his kind of connections in the sports industry and media and what have you. So we went through kind of blow by blow, what did we need in terms of the organisation. But I think it's also quite key to add, Sean, that where we've looked at it is we've also brought in other support that sits a tier below that. So we do have a contract with an HR specialist agency that works in the charitable sector. So any new policies, anything else that we need to do, that gets flagged to us straight away. We have that. We have an appointed accountant who works with the board to make sure that we get our quarterly finances brought forward. And obviously now that we're in a point where we need the audit, we need to be kept kind of very much that we have the right processes in place there. And we do work with the NSPCC for training and safeguarding and making sure that everyone's across it. So I think you've got the trustee board, but it can be quite scary if you actually go to the trustee board and say, all of this is your responsibility. So we have brought on a kind of another layer of expertise that sits below that. And that's really
just so they just sit in that supervisory role just to share
exactly. And I think that what that does, Sean, is I think it's twofold. One is I think it gives us as an organisation a little bit more of a feeling of security that we are covered in those key areas. But I think in terms of the growth of the organisation, a lot of funders, I think, increasingly are looking at the sort of the due diligence and the management of organisations. And we've started to work with people like the International Fund for Ireland, the European Union. So obviously that sort of due diligence and management and policies becomes increasingly a part of the fundraising and sustainability process. So it's not just around looking after yourself in the legal side. There is actually a practical application in terms of how you grow and sustain the work of your organisation.
Absolutely, and obviously an effective trustee board. I like that as you describe it. That supporting management support that's there underneath means that the charity can focus on doing the good stuff that it's doing, as opposed to just dealing with all the regulatory requirements, which can.
And
be
I think also just in terms of making sure that the trustees are around it. Joe was talking around the idea of understanding sort of around risk assessment and what that actually means. So some of our board, we've kind of got almost a kind of a sub board, which is an audit committee that we've put together that particularly has the accountant, two of the board members and the senior management team. That meets every couple of months, and we break down within that sort of audit committee, not just the financial side of the audit, but also where the risks are in terms of personnel and HR, where the risks are in terms of any political changes that may have come around that impacts on our organisation, where the risks are in terms of key members of staff going on annual leave or going on extended sick leave or whatever. So we do have this sort of risk and audit committee that we also implement alongside. So again, trustee eyes are across it all the time. They're not involved in the day-to-day what happens on the ground, but in terms of the big picture, the trustees are cited at all times.
And so, and Joe, do you see that as something? Oh, we've got a question from Jodie Sudden, which I'll come to. But is that something you see as having these, let's say, subsidiaries of the trustee board, the audit and risk committee, the safeguarding committee, wherever it may be? Would you recommend that as sort of best practice for trustee? Because I do know that some of the smaller charities in particular, though, obviously struggle with time and effort, and it can fall on just the one trustee to be responsible for that. And that I know that's weighted heavily on the people that I've spoken to who volunteer on these boards, that it can feel like a lot.
Yeah, definitely. As long as the sort of delegated authority is clearly documented, it's important to note that you can have authority to deal with issues like safeguarding, as the big one in the sports sector. It's certainly worth having those subcommittees, but it's important to note that the overall responsibility for the principal will always sit with the trustee. So as long as the trustee doesn't think, oh, it's great, I've got my committee set up, I'll have my feet back and make sure that this stays on my CV. It's the responsibility will always still sit with the trustee. So it's important just to make sure that you've got oversight of that committee. Conscious that they'll be meeting maybe without the trustee, but some delegated authority and subcommittee clauses have a requirement in there to have at least one trustee, for example. It's not an absolute requirement, but it's just recommended in terms of keeping oversight of those.
From our best practice side of it, Sean, we kind of identify we've got two trustees, the accountant and the legal trustee, that sit on that, and it reports back in as a standing agenda item into the the trustee board meetings. So just to clarify, it's not a delegated authority, it's just a delegated overview to be able to really go into the issues.
Brilliant, thank you. So as you were saying this, Joe, I was thinking it's like your approach of not what to do is like a David Brent approach to being a trustee of a charity. Just put your feet up and not do much. Right, we've got a great question from Jodie Seddons, who asks, on trustee skill set, to what extent does the UK Sport Code for Sport Governance influence, guide the trustee skill set for sports charities? And related, do sports charities ever access funding from UK sport?
It's a great question.
Yeah.
I think because the UK Sport Code and the UK Sport Code and sports governance influences the sort of skills audit that you will undertake, because there's the tiered system in terms of the requirements which are expected in order to, I think in most cases, unlock funding and support from UK Sport and Sport England as well.
Correct.
So I think it definitely helps as an exercise to go through, specifically related to charities. But yeah, it will certainly feed into it, because for those tiered approaches, tier 1, tier 2, through to 3, it sets out those requirements, so that whereby doing that, you'll sort of think, okay, well, how will we meet this requirement? Okay, this is actually highlighted that perhaps we've got a bit of a gap here. So to be able to meet this approach and able to satisfy this requirement, let's look to expand our skills on that.
Yeah, and Gary, you talked about Sport England, I think earlier, but in terms of, I guess you obviously got the Code for Sport Governance in the UK. I don't think do UK Sport. I don't think UK Sport just funds the Olympic program, doesn't it? Right? Maybe there's some of our colleagues here.
Yeah,
that
I've never
England that
accessed
does
funding from
yeah.
UK Sport.
No.
It tends to go through Sport England,
Yeah.
because Sport England, when we've worked with them, because they're more in the community space, and there's also been a recognition that sport is not just around the growth of a sport, though that's changed recently. But over the last few years, there's always been this drive around how sport has community benefit. So I think that it's been a little bit more liberal there. I think it's probably different if you're a sports charity that maybe doubles up or feeds into a national governing body. That's where you've got your UK Sport link. But I have to be honest, that's not something I've ever
I think
been involved with, Sean.
I think years ago we did an article on this with Vijay Parbat when he was at UK Sport, just trying to identify that. It said the funding for UK Sport is around the Olympic program and the
excellence, the strive for excellence, and UK Sport tends to look after. Sport England are around participation and community.
Yeah, exactly. I hope that was helpful, but I think that the lesson there being, if I'm right, Joe, would be that you've got your trustee board responsibilities, and then you've got your overlaying if you're looking for funding or for participation or whatever the activity is with whether it's the European Commission or Sport England. You just have to overlay that over the top, right? But
that's absolutely right. And whilst the requirements for these, if I just refer to them as the funding bodies, may be more specific, they will always co-align with the core responsibilities. It would be challenging to find an example where they encourage you to breach a trustee duty, or a charity law. You'd like to think that they dovetail quite nicely.
Brilliant. Oh no, I remember years ago I got quite interested in charity law, and for the reason that I felt there was more, as a similar to Joe, there was more. I felt there was more focus on this sort of on the conflict of interest point. Was this highlighted more in the charity space than sometimes it was in the corporate space, and conflict of loyalty. Should we come back to the slides? So coming on then, so we've gone through that, and then do you want to just quickly touch on then this role of the Charity Commission? So obviously that's quite significant, and again, respectively in each country you'll have no doubt your statutory body that you have to comply with, but from the UK perspective, the Charity Commission.
Absolutely, yeah. I think that ultimately the overall consensus and theme tends to be that charities should always be proactive rather than reactive. We spoke about that earlier when talking about policies, but ultimately the Charity Commission is a regulator. What it makes very clear is that it won't mediate internal disputes between trustees. It will get involved when those matters become serious. As again mentioned earlier, the trigger can be something such as filing accounts wrong late. You know, the Charity Commission could think, that's a bit of a red flag. We'll have a look into it, make sure everything's going smoothly and above board. But yeah, as I say, it provides a plethora of guidance, as there is so much out there and available. Towards the end of the slides, there's a quick guide which is linked in terms of there's a trustee quiz within that. There's 5-minute guides, but then there is also that more detailed CC guidance within that. So it will act as a regulator in those serious instances.
Brilliant. So I'm coming. I've just got a question coming in. I'm just conscious because I'm looking at the time, thinking time's flying by. Hopefully people watching it is. I'm a bit of a geek with these sort of things, so I probably enjoy this more than most people do. But the I apologise if I'm going to say your name wrong. Pranav Subramanian. Question to, so sincere apologies if I've pronounced that incorrectly. Question to all the panelists. In addition to the legal compliances and duties of a trustee, what do you think is also a key factor in building trust and goodwill with donors and the public at large? Because that would be important in building relationships and securing donations. I guess is a great question, and one that all charities have to face. I don't know who wants to sort of tackle that first.
Gary, would you like to kick off?
Yeah, I'll kick off, Joe. Yeah, I think they're two slightly different things, Sean, really, but absolutely building trust with funders and with the public is a key thing in the growth of any charity. So from our perspective, I suppose there are if you like, the obvious factors around making sure you've got your monitoring, your evaluation, you know, making sure that you fully understand what the funder expects, that you can back that up with all of the hard quantitative data, so that you know numbers, how many young people, what regularity they attend, any qualifications, where they've progressed onto. So being able to capture all of that, but also backing that up with sort of qualitative, you know, case studies, the stories, bringing those sort of numbers to life is quite key. Because I think in terms of the Rio Ferdinand Foundation, we've managed to engage a lot more with the public and with private sector donors and organisations when they can actually see that work in practice. But at the same time, when they do their checks and balances, we've invested X amount of money to deliver X outcomes, we can actually back that up with a strong evidence base. So I think there is something about being able to actually capture your impacts, but also tell the story of it is quite key. And I think for some funders, it's something that we've stepped into the last 3 or 4 years. If you've got independent evaluations of the work, so for instance, the work that we've just been doing in Ireland, University of Ulster have just done a 1-year sort of impact assessment that we'll be publishing in a couple of weeks. I think that those kind of things are really, really strong in terms of building the relationship with the public and the funders. You know, being able to be seen as being able to tell the story, relate to it, and make it really sort of understandable that the money's going where it needs to be. I think if you're looking at funders more broadly, there's also something around engaging with them, especially if you're talking about the corporate sector. It's about building relationships, and again, this is where trustees can be quite key, but it's also around your senior staff team, around how you build those relationships, get them to engage with the program, with the young people, having the trustees sit down and talk about the aims, objectives, and being able to do it with passion is the key, so that people know that it's meant. So there is all of the legal side of it, but I think, you know, one of the things that I think for me as a trustee, and it may not come under a legal requirement, Joe, but all of the trustees we appoint have to have a passion for the work we do, an understanding for it, and be able to talk that talk in a way that people can relate to. So for me, coming back to the point, because I could labour on that forever, I think it's about making sure you've got an evidence base, making sure you can tell the story, and making sure you've got people that can build those relationships and engage with passion around the work you're trying to do. And I think that applies trustees right the way through every level of your staff team.
And no doubt as well, Joe, on this point, so that seems like very good advice, that misrepresenting any of that information, because I know sometimes people, again, either intentionally or unintentionally, could be legally problematic as well, right? So if you are going to undertake that exercise, making sure it's accurate, because I imagine if you do, maybe Joe, I'll just leave you to talk on that for a second.
Yeah, absolutely. The key principles there are always going to be transparency, alongside also sort of compliance/accountability. Ultimately, funders, whether that be someone who chucks a couple of coppers in a bucket outside the supermarket, all the way up to the local authorities which are providing grant funding, ultimately they're going to want to know where their money's going and that it's going to the right places. You know, we've seen too many stories in the press recently about charities losing trust and confidence from the public. Fortunately, I don't have the stats off the top of my head, but fortunately last year the statistics were going back in the right direction after some of the stories we saw after COVID in terms of public trust going back up in charities. So yeah, certainly as we've seen from the trustee duties, accountability is huge, and that does also feed in with compliance, but also transparency. I think those case study stories, where appropriate and where available, certainly go a long way in terms of showing this is our outreach, this is what we've been able to achieve, really sort of showcasing and showing off the achievements that the charity's been able to achieve.
And can I ask Gary, from a practical perspective, because funding is, as you know, is almost like a full-time job if you're in a charity. In terms of the hierarchy of the information when you're applying for funding, where do you rank your essentially audit, or the partners that you, in this case University of Ulster or others, where do you rank that in terms of the hierarchy of information? Is that something you put as a footnote to say, and by the way, we talked to you about all this great work that we do and we get audited, or do you say all of the great work we do is audited, and because no doubt you thought about this?
It would depend on the funder, Sean,
Right.
being brutally honest.
Okay.
As it's probably a bit of a catch-all, but as a general indicator, what I've found is when we're dealing with sort of corporate or private sector partners, they want to know about the work first, they want to know about the impacts first, and then the due diligence of the audit processes and the management and the policies would come as a sort of a secondary level. But if you're talking about somebody like the European Union or some local authorities or government departments, quite often the first thing they want to know is, can we trust you with this money? Is it actually kind of accountable? Can you demonstrate the outcomes? And then they want to get into the detail of the work. So it's very much depends on the funder. But as a general rule of thumb, private sector tend to want to know more about the delivery and the outcomes first, and then they'll get into the management of the charity. If you're working with government or European Union type organisations, it's the other way around. They want to make sure that you're if they're going to put 50,000, 500,000 into your pocket, that you are an organisation that can be trusted with that amount of money.
Brilliant, thank you. And we've got I think this will be a quick one for you, Joe. Is the Charity Commission able to assist where a charity needs to close? It relates to a charitable fund. This is an anonymous attendee. Charitable fund, a chair, through the age we're running out of organisation members and relevant people to whom benefit from the fund. So does the Charity Commission provide guidance on that? Or
there is certainly guidance. The short answer is no. I really wish there was a sort of a matchmaking service, so to speak, whereby where there's a charity with assets that isn't able to run anymore, to find charities with similar objects that could sort of absorb that. There is guidance online, and I've just looked it up so that it can sort of signpost. A lot of it is to do with the steps to take, but it is quite simply called How to Close a Charity. It speaks through the steps which need to be taken before you consider that ultimate decision. It's such an unfortunate situation, and we do see it quite commonly. What the Commission will assist with, unofficially, they're not able to sort of answer, they're not able to advise what to do, but in a situation where you're considering either merging with another charity that has sufficiently similar objects or dissolving, the first step should always be what your governing document says about dissolution. It's very often that it's once all the so the net assets, once all the debts are paid and you're left with a pot, essentially the general principle will be to distribute to either pursuant to the objects or to a charity or an organization with similar objects. So always check the governing document first, but as and when you're considering that next step to take, whether it be merge, dissolve, when you contact the Commission, they are helpful with guidance in terms of what you can and can't do, essentially. I hope that helps. But there is how to close a charity is the guidance.
That's great, and my amazing, and apologies again, everyone knows that when I do these things, this one should always get an independent chair if I have to do these things, but I've given you an impossible task to go through some key points. Is there anything in the sort of the next 5 minutes that you think is in key things, Joe, that you would want to highlight?
Yeah, absolutely. As I say, the slides will be shared. So if we move on to the Charity Governance Code, it is extremely, well, I don't want to say extremely similar, but the principle is the same as the UK sports code in terms of it's sort of like see it as a kind of internal audit. You know, it's not mandatory, it's not a legal requirement, but what it really does is just help identify those core principles. So this is the code here, literally just picked up and plotted onto the slides from the code. Yeah, it splits into two charities from the guidance that I've seen on the code's website. Larger charities are the charities with an income of 1 million and more, £1 million and more. So can be a bit of ambiguity as to what classes a large and small charity. Once you've sort of digested the code and given it a good read through, the principles are on the next slide, just as a very, very brief overview. It then moves on to what's called the diagnostic tool, or the toolkit is commonly referred to. Now, this really gives either a subcommittee or a select committee of a few trustees, really gives the opportunity to, I've included an extract on the slide just to show you what it does. I think it's a lot more pages than this, but what it does is, as you can see, 1.3, 1.3.1, 1.3.2, it goes through scenarios and essentially gives you the best way to treat this is treat it as if you've been provided with this in order to attract some grant funding, for example. Being able to show this, and then you're really just doing that kind of internal audit. Of course, you know, it comes with the benefit of having time to do so. It's not always going to be the top of the priority, but as and when there are those times to have these proactive steps, the diagnostic toolkit, alongside obviously material that UK Sport can provide, it's a very good and useful tool, and it's completely free as well.
Yeah, it's great, and I think and Gary, from what you were saying again, having that audit and risk committee, there's be something no doubt that's embedded within that's being regularly reviewed, right? So it doesn't become such a big task once you've done that already, then it becomes this rolling agenda item, right? Which makes it much more palatable and manageable.
Yeah, exactly. It's just about embedding it into the natural flow of the trustees meeting and the senior management, of course, because the CEO and the directors aren't absolved from their responsibility in this either.
Brilliant. And then we've got another question, Pranav again. If a donor is insisting on stringent indemnity liability clauses, how would you address the same to safeguard the charity? Especially, you would not want to lose the funding or jeopardize the relationship, because this is certainly a risk for charities that agree to these type of clauses. I think that's a great question in terms of, we talk about trustee duty, obviously the source of funding and what you do around that and the clauses you put in is incredibly important.
Yeah, it is. It is a fantastic question, and unfortunately, a lot of it does boil down to the bargaining power in terms of, you know, the charity will always need and want the funding, but ultimately, if there is that jeopardy to the delivery of the objects, if they're asking you to agree to terms which just aren't commercially viable to agree to, you need to kind of weigh up the balance between how worthy the funding is in terms of in relation and proportion to the clauses which are being asked. But you know, the typical lawyer speech, always seek advice on the clauses which are being asked to be agreed to, essentially. So yeah, it's yeah, apologies, I'm not able to go into any more detail than that without looking at any clauses.
Do you know, though, it's one of the areas where there's a lot of great people that work in sport. A lot of people want to do stuff for free, but one area that you should probably invest money in is on those high risk sort of agreements, because you know, spending a few £100, whatever it may be, will be well worth it in the long run. Gary, from a practical perspective, you've gone more to, I think it's right for to say that you're obviously going to more private sector funding now and some of the work that you're doing. Is that something that's come up in sort of that you've had to consider in terms of what you're signing up to?
I think it's not that we've gone more to private sector funding, Sean. I think what we've done is, in order to make sure, you know, in the current climate, it's challenging out there. So we've tried to move towards more of a mixed economy.
Right.
So doing a lot more sort of work that generates income from various sources, whereas previously we would probably have been quite heavily reliant on the likes of the lottery and comic relief, all the traditional funders, if you like.
Yeah.
We've just decided to diversify a little bit. It's something we have come across once or twice, and as the charities matured and we managed to kind of diversify a little bit, we have actually walked away from a couple of funders when what they were asking us to sign up to wasn't really sort of we didn't think as a trustee board and senior management committee that it was worth it. But it's a difficult one because you know, as the person who asked the question said, sometimes as a charity you're reliant on that funding to keep it going. So fortunately, it's not something I've come across massively. But in all of the cases, I just go back and I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not taking the lawyer stance here. But I would always take advice, because sometimes the implications can be huge if you sign up to something that you can't deliver on, or you're signing up to clauses that put you at risk if anything goes wrong. So, you know, it's always was it belt and braces in those situations, I think.
And also, I think the key, it's a great sort of question, I guess, to wrap up on, which is, again, it highlights the reason why you need very competent, capable trustees. So when you're taking that decision, you've got a well thought out, reasoned decision that you can stand by, right? That you know, again, as you were saying, Gary, when you're walking away from money, when you know that money could be deployed to really impact people's lives, that's really hard for people to make that decision. You know, ways in you individually is much better if you have that diverse group of people that you can speak to with the right expertise. The one thing I was going to mention, actually, I failed to mention this, for anyone on the webinar or listen to the recording, as Law in Sport, any trustees for charities, if they're looking for skill base and they want to advertise any roles, we do that for free. As part of our sort of like wider, we say we're always an organisation that optimises for impact first, but that's one of the areas that we try to leverage it. That there's a whole bunch from the legal community or from the financial sector as well, who are members or readers of Law in Sport. So if there are anyone who needs any help with that, just let us know. We're happy to promote that to our membership, to our how many thousand people, our email subscribers, and 2 million readers a year. So happy to do that. The other thing I should say is a huge thank you to Joe and Gary. Gary's actually on holiday at the moment. Well, just back from holiday, but actually not at work. So Gary, a special thank you for you for agreeing to do this whilst being meant to be not working. I love this. Is it? That's not an effective holiday when you're doing a webinar, but look, really appreciate it. Both of them, they're doing this because they want to share knowledge. If you've taken value from this, if there's things you want to follow up with on the slides, Joe's got his contact details. Please do tell people, as we always ask. We don't charge for this type of webinar. We think it's important to share knowledge. If you got a lot from it, please share it with people that you think will be relevant and find it useful. And huge thank you to Gary and Joe. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Sean. Thanks,
Pleasure.
everybody.
Thank you for everyone making the time.
Brilliant. Thanks for your questions. They're excellent. Have a nice day, everyone. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.